School Days for Sunday, April 4th, 1982. A look at the one-room schoolhouse, its past, present, and future with reporter David McAnally.
Historically, of course,
Join us as we present the best of America's best, the single best product from each state, 50 products in all.
Might hear lack of training on part of the teacher, cold rooms, mile walk through snows, lack of textbooks, having perhaps 8 grades in one room. I think eventually we will find out we come to the final point that is a real honest point, and that is the country schools did succeed.
It's close. It's a close-knit, generally homogeneous. That is always true. But there is the prevailing, I believe, attitude toward support and helping children learn.
Politician, historian, educator, all talking about what they perceive to be the virtue of the one-room schoolhouse, the country school. For those of us in the Midwest, there is probably no institution that better symbolizes our independence and our strength as a people than the picture of the little schoolhouse sitting solitary on a broad, sweeping landscape. Public school education came to the Midlands in the wake of the pioneer trek westward during the middle of the last century. At one time, there were some 7,000 districts across Nebraska alone. Today, though, that number stands at about 1,045. Some 400 of those are still one-room schoolhouses, but the trend has been downward. Still, the country school is a fiber tightly woven into the fabric of the Midlands, an institution with its roots in the New England states.
As education moved west, in the settling of the West, the New England pattern, which was the origin of the public school as we know it, because they said that for every community with 50 or more souls in it would support a school from the general revenues collected from those persons.
The teachers were dedicated, the students were eager to learn, there was strong parental support, because the people who came here in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, one of the most important things going through their mind was they wanted their children to have a good education. And the school was one of the first structures put up in these communities. The school became the center of the community.
It was the law, just as much as any individual initiative, that led the way to opening the doors to the one-room schoolhouses along the Midland prairies, first in the east and then in the west.
well, of course, country schools were begun in the eastern part of the state, since the state was settled first there. And more or less around 1854, shortly thereafter, because that's when Nebraska was made a territory, and the Indians were in the process of being expelled from Nebraska. So they began and followed the lines of settlement, or the advancing line of settlement westward as the state filled up.
Dr. Ernest Grundy is a professor in interdisciplinary studies at Kearney State College. Recently, he completed research on Nebraska's country school legacy as part of an 8-state project documenting the West's educational heritage.
After we became a territory, then there were enabling laws that suggested that schools be set up. And that, of course, was true after Nebraska became a state, too. So it was a legal matter that they have schools.
Out on the windswept prairie, up in the clear cold mountains, stands a little country schoolhouse with a bell and a pot-bellied stove. Down in the red clay canyons, way out on a grassy hill, we haven't forgotten our little country school from long ago. And you know we never will.
While the one-room schoolhouse may have found its mandate in the Book of Law, there was an irrepressible thirst for education among the early pioneers who settled the Midlands. Many were immigrants from foreign lands with foreign tongues and customs who sought to fit into a new nation and to build a way of life in a land of seemingly boundless opportunity. Professor Ernest Grundy of Kearney State College has studied the one-room schoolhouse.
You may be acquainted with Life in an American Denmark, which is a story written by A.C. Nielsen. But it's about a little Danish settlement lying about 5 miles northwest of Dannebrog, Nebraska. And he says that unconsciously, the schools were the primary agent in Americanizing the little Danish kids. He thought it rather a good thing, too, because he didn't think that the schools that spoke Danish should really have continued. But he said that when the children played on the playgrounds of the public schools, they did not have the wars of the Danes against the Germans, for instance. They rather had the Battle of San Juan Hill in the Spanish-American War, or the Battle of Bunker Hill in the Revolutionary War. And he said it was an unconscious and gradual process that they became Americanized.
It was the old melting pot theory, and it was the belief that we had immigrants, as we're now having today, who came in, and that they had, that in order to become American citizens and to participate in this democracy, that education was important. The public schools had to take everybody, and I think they've been very successful.
It was an unconscious and gradual process that they became Americanized that way. And in the case of my mother, who spoke only German in the 1880s, I asked her once how she ever came to speak English and to drop the German, and she could not remember a single word of the German. She said she doesn't know. It was just that everyone spoke English, and that's the way they learned it.
The Americanization of the immigrant, the socialization of the indigenous American, took place in a setting not unlike this one. Indeed, the country school legacy in the Midlands has been a rich one, with a number of authors and historians dedicating much time to studying the past, trying to recreate it in the present.
While schools were built out of many materials, most of the material was the kind that you found on hand. By this I mean there were, of course, frame buildings, there were sod, there were some log, a few stone, a few brick, and even one out in Scottsbluff County that was made out of baled hay.
Warren Rogers is education director at the Store Museum in Grand Island, where a once operating country school has been carefully restored.
It is a typical country school that one would have found dotted across the prairies in the 1880s and 1890s. One room, rows of desks, pot-bellied stove in the center, teacher's desk up front, blackboard. In this case, we have a small organ up front where they could sing their songs. Some schools would have had a piano if they could have afforded it.
Student left home, generally he walked no more than 2 miles. It was an unusual case if he had to walk more than 2 or 3 miles. He would leave home about 8:15, just as early as he could, in fact, so that he could get to school and play. But school generally took up at 9 o'clock. And about 9 o'clock, there were generally 15 minutes for opening exercises, which could have been singing a quotation from the Bible, or perhaps a teacher reading. In my case, it was the teacher reading Zane Grey's novels to us. He loved them, and so did we. Well, followed generally then, I think, arithmetic or reading came next. The teacher would try to work arithmetic and reading in the morning. At 12, there'd be an hour's lunch, and the children would get out their syrup buckets in which they had placed their cold jelly, sandwiches, and perhaps an apple and a cookie, and have them, and at 1 o'clock school would take up, followed by some of the softer subjects, I suppose one might say. The spelling, the penmanship, the music occasionally, and this kind of thing. At 4 o'clock then, school would dismiss. The kids would trail out along the road where, incidentally, they picked up a lot of social knowledge.
My district school was 108. I remember it vividly. One-room schoolhouse, one teacher, but we got along just fine.
Describe have you a particularly vivid memory about that time?
Well, I don't know. I suppose maybe our happiest times, and this is kind of unusual, was going to and from school. Now I guess the kids all kind of joke about recess being the best part of the educational process. But we had a great time as we walked up the highway, picking up other students, going to school, you know, and then in the evening when we'd go home, we all went together, and it was just a social occasion.
And then fight, they would flirt, and so on as they went to the various homes. Those days are pretty much gone.
We haven't forgotten our little country school from long ago, and you know we never will.
While we often recall the country school in romantic terms, the little schoolhouse nestled in the countryside, the legacy of the country school would be unimportant without curriculum.
I don't think the curriculum has changed all that much. I think it perhaps has been enriched and enhanced, as I say, by the use of films, film strips, the use of television, the use of computers, which have, and the services that have come in from specialists, let's say, in music and art, in physical education. But the core subjects, the social studies, the math, the science, and the communication skills, reading and writing, speaking, have not changed. Not changed. We're doing pretty much what we've done all the way through.
Very strong, positive, affirmative things to say about the education. Younger students learning from older students. Older students learning because they assisted in the instruction, almost a tutoring program. They didn't call it that, but that's really what it came. So the younger learned from the older, and the older ones learned from the younger. And there was constant review, there was constant helping and assisting, and this is all a part of good education. And so with all of these things combined, coming back to that term again, there was tremendous success.
The individualized attention and the constant reinforcements of lessons learned that are peculiar to the country school are pointed to most often when scholars speak of the country school and its strong points.
All the country school teachers I've talked to, and some of them have been in the early 80s on down, have stressed the fact that they hit the basics hard. We've always heard that about the country school, of course. In fact, we've heard that about all education in general in previous times.
Just as the buildings differed in construction, obviously there were differences from school to school in what was taught, but there were some basics that were common threads of instruction. And by this I mean solid subjects. Geography, math, arithmetic was very important. Here again, much of the arithmetic was taught by, well, we wouldn't use the term today, rote, I guess, memorization. There was considerable memorization of multiplication tables, division, and so forth.
Warren Rogers is himself a one-time educator who these days serves as education director at Grand Island Stir Museum. He's studied the country school extensively and has these observations.
For most country schools and for most communities, the most important subject was spelling. If you did not learn to spell correctly, normally you kind of incurred a small wrath of that teacher because it was deemed to be a vital thing that you just simply would do. Reading was deemed to be extremely important, and of course spelling and reading certainly are brothers. One of the thing about these reading texts that might surprise some people if they were not acquainted with it, of course. The reading texts were not of the kind of see Jack run down the hill. Normally they were full of selections from the great authors. Longfellow, one could go through a very long list of these, but they took selections. So not only was their learning of reading correctly, but at the same time they also accomplished a very close acquaintanceship with good works of literature.
The country school of bygone days, indeed today's country school, saw students ages 5 through 15 or older assembled under one roof, each group learning at its own level. It was this grouping of young with old, advanced with the less advanced, that in itself served as a unique teaching tool.
Former Senator Carl T. Curtis, I believe he attended country school something like 4 or 5 years, and he said that's one real advantage, that when he was a third grader, for instance, he heard 8th grade material. And conversely, when he was a 5th grader, then he had a nice review over 2nd and 3rd grade material. In my own case, in a 2-teacher village school, I remember hearing the 5th grade physiology class, now that's not health habits, that's physiology, trace the food through the human body. And I think about the 2nd grade I could do that, simply from having listened.
While educators and historians find much merit in the philosophy behind country school education, the individual attention, the repetition of lesson, for today's teacher, there are frustrations.
I would say the biggest disadvantage is the lack of time, as far as just doing extra things. The extra activities, whether they're be in social studies or science experiments or anything that we do, we all do together and we enjoy them, but there's a definite lack of time. With 9 grades and 6 subject levels in each grade, they're just having 5 and 10 minute classes I have not gotten used to yet. It's just really frustrating sometimes to get everything in. In fact, it's almost impossible to get everything in every day like you should. I think there's a definite disadvantage for the 7th and 8th graders particularly. Now there aren't many schools in the county that still hold 7th and 8th grade in the rural schools. And the 7th and 8th grader that I have this year, they enjoy being here, but I can see some disadvantages to them being here also. They're missing out on a lot of things that they would be getting if they were in town, just extracurricular activities, sports, music, home ec, drama, and there's even some disadvantages as far as their academics go, because were they in town, they would be getting a specialized teacher in every subject, and they'd be spending, half an hour at least a day on every subject, and there just isn't time for that here.
The verdict on the merit of the country school and its instructional peculiarities appears split. Though there is more individualized attention, more emphasis on the basics, more exposure to a given subject through yearly repetition, the constraints placed on a teacher's time as he or she attempts to administer that individualized instruction can be frustrating at best, counterproductive at worst.
In Kansas and Nebraska, Colorado too, we learned our ABCs. We added 1, 2, 3s. We sat down when we missed a word at the good old spelling bees. So out on the windswept prairie, up in the clear cold mountains, stands a little country schoolhouse with a bell and a pot-bellied stove. Down in the red clay canyons, way out on a grassy hill, we haven't forgotten our little country school from long ago, and you know we never will.
In a period when hands-on experience is considered by some educators to be just as important as theory or textbooks, we find that some school districts, such as this one in Grand Island, are turning to the use of preserved country schoolhouses to teach Nebraska history. So we came to the Seedling Mile Elementary School here in Grand Island to talk with Judy Campbell, the principal here who coordinates the program for the Grand Island District.
The purpose of taking students from our district to the country school is to focus on cultural awareness through the visual arts. We feel that because Stuhr Museum is a very accessible and wonderful resource to us, that our students can benefit by going back and actually they spend a half day in the old schoolhouse during their tour, and to find out what life was like as students lived it back in the olden days. They do spelling, they have spell downs, they use slates, they have a pot-bellied stove that provides their heat. It's very authentic. It's one way through living it to really not only experience it, but I think remember it.
Jantel teaches the 4th grade at Grand Island Seedling Mile Elementary School. She's also taught at the Stuhr Museum's one-room schoolhouse, an experience that's given her an appreciation of the task that faced and continues to face the rural school teacher. Did you find that teaching at the Stuhr did it give you the feeling that the teacher's role must have been more difficult, let's say 100 years ago or even 50 years ago?
Yes, I think it would have been more difficult. For one reason, they would have had from K through 7th grade maybe in one classroom, and they'd have to individualize just about all of their teaching for each math group, each reading group, and all through their subjects. And also with the media, you don't have the extra things that you can plug into what they're teaching.
Education back then, I think, was based more on the teacher presenting the material to the kids and the kids just sitting and absorbing the material. Today, we use more child involvement, so we need different types of materials that the children themselves can use, as opposed to just having them recite and memorize and sit still and listen.
You had to study in an environment where there was no central heating, where you didn't have the pens and the pencils that you have now, where there weren't film and slide projectors and all of those conveniences that teachers use today to get their message across. What was that like? Did that make studying and learning harder, or did it make it easier? What do you think?
No, not really. It was just the same. It was the same, except for sometimes we'd have to write on slates instead of paper. They had, my grandparents would say that it was a lot harder to go to school back then because they just had one recess a day, and the lessons were all much harder without all the creativity that they have today.
Educators will say that curriculum is important in teaching. Of course, there is one factor that must not be excluded from any evaluation of the effectiveness of the country school, and that is the country school teacher.
Up until about 1880, there were an awful lot of males teaching. But as I understand, when conditions demanded more male help in Nebraska in the 1880s, then the women began to teach in greater numbers. Primarily, the women were girls who had gotten out of grade school. An outstanding instance is Mari Sandoz, who started to school rather late. She was 8 or 9, and by 17 she was teaching school, having gotten her county certificate.
By teaching standards and college education, perhaps we would look back from today and say, well, the teachers were badly educated, they were not informed to teach. But the teachers were dedicated.
These were an unusual group, these young ladies, say, and young men. Primarily, I think they got along so well because they were bookishly inclined. If you lived 15 miles north of Broken Bow and you were bookishly inclined, what else could you do? Well, you could perhaps become a preacher. The second thing you could do would be to become a school teacher.
It wasn't until 1976 that Nebraska used the bachelor's degree as the base. We allowed teachers in the rural schools and the teachers in the small town schools K-6 to teach with less than a bachelor's degree for a number of years. And as I say, in 76, then it was required to teach in all schools.
Thus far, we've talked about the history, the heritage, if you will, of the one-room schoolhouse. We've discussed it from the point of view of the romantic notion of the tiny building huddled away in the countryside, where a small group of students receive considerable individual attention from a kindly old motherly teacher. That view is a romantic one. The country school, in many cases, is like that today. But there is a movement here in Lincoln at this state capitol, and it has recurred over 2 decades, that would force the consolidation of rural school districts, now known as Class 1 districts, with larger districts. In effect, the elimination of the country school, the one-room schoolhouse. The Senate's Education Committee considered LB 319 in its last session, but failed to vote it out of committee, apparently because its provisions, the forced consolidation of rural districts, was too hot to touch in an election year. Urban senators liked 319 because, theoretically, it would put rural taxpayers, assessed as little as 1 mil for school taxes, on a more equitable footing with their city cousins, whose assessments sometimes reach 50 mils. Rural senators, like Anselmo's Howard Lamb, disagree that there is any tax inequity.
Agricultural people in general, farmers and ranchers, have to have a high investment in order to stay in business, in order to earn their income. Much higher investment than does the ordinary person who lives in the city working for a wage. So when you multiply the lower mill levy in the country by the very high investment which is required, and most of that investment is probably borrowed money. It's not money that the person has. The total support for the school is in most cases higher for the rural family than it is for the urban family with comparable income.
The people who live in cities are paying a rather heavy cost for public education because they go into debt for the buildings. They maintain the staff, they maintain the programs that are there for and a good curriculum, and that becomes a luxury then for others who use it because they're really not paying all that much for it.
The fight over consolidation promises to continue, with the solution likely lying somewhere in the middle, perhaps voluntary mergers. In the past, the country school has served us well. Perhaps it has a future.
I would hope that not all country schools would disappear, because they still, in 1982, they still have success. And I think perhaps even in methods of instruction, they still have some things back to which we look with a little admiration.
I think its primary role is as a model. And I think that's why we study history of any kind. That's why I think the project I've been on was a good project because it helped to bring out what was done in the past. And we're going to draw from the past, we're going to improve on the past, then we have to know what it was.
We haven't forgotten our little country school. And you know